Hello, everyone. This is Peter Deswood. I wanted to share one of my favorite books. It's called Hosteen Klah, Navajo Medicine Man and Sand Painter. It's written by Frank Johnson Newcomb. So I'm going to read some of this and we'll see how it goes. Again, I've read this when I was in college. It's printed by the University of Oklahoma. You can get it on Amazon. Okay. So here's it's kind of tattered, the book is. So I'll start with the introduction. For some years it has been my ambition to write at least a portion of the biography of Hosteen Klah, the noted medicine man, wealthy stockman, and unsurpassed weaver who played such an important role in our lives while we were living on the Navajo reservation. During the quarter of a century, my husband, myself, and our children owned and operated the Peshtokish trading post. Klah with his clan family were our neighbors, our helpers, and our best friends. It was through this influence that I was able to attend Navajo religious ceremonies, and it was with his permission that I started making sketches of his sacred sand paintings. Although we did not realize it at the time, we started our trading post. The land on which our buildings were located was part of the domain over which his great-grandfather, Chief Narbona, had ruled and might be considered part of Klah's inheritance. Klah told us that his ancestors had come from the north to these blue mountains 7 generations before his birth to find them uninhabited, well-watered, and abounding in game animals. So here they had built their hogans and established rights of water, fields, and hunting areas. It was from this location their women had acquired the clan name of Zitlan, meaning brow of the mountain, as it was always the women who chose the places to live, and it was through the women that clan names and property rights descended generation after generation. The 7 generations Klah mentioned cannot be easily translated into years, as his Navajo word could also be translated as meaning 7 lifetimes, which would be much longer than period. During our early years at the post, Klah, his mother, and his sister and her 4 daughters were living 2 or 3 miles east of us in a cluster of hogans built on the edge of their cornfields. They were one of the wealthiest Navajo families living in our valley, owning more than 2,000 sheep and a number of cattle and horses. As they were frequent customers at our store, we soon became friends and visited back and forth. Klah always visited us to any special occasions. It was then I became interested in learning more of the history of this group of Navajos among whom we were living, especially of its older members. Nearly all of these old ones had lived through the period of soldier oppression, taken the long walk to Bosque Redondo, and returned to a ravaged land. How they managed to be such an industrious, good-natured people and still friendly to the whites was amazing to me after hearing the personal stories of hardship, persecution, slavery, semi-starvation, and heroic self-denial they were almost afraid to tell. I could hardly believe some of the events related, but I found them corroborated in war records, old government bulletins, and histories of the Navajo people. These gave me the names of the places and the people connected to these events and the dates they took place. I decided it would be interesting to record the personal stories of 8 of our oldest Navajo neighbors. The central theme would be their recollections of the trip to the Bosque Redondo, the lives they led while there, and the return to their homeland. Claw's mother, nearly 80 years of age, but still remarkably active and as mentally alert as any of her grandchildren, was the first person I approached on the subject. It was not difficult to gain her consent, for her great-granddaughter, Lucy Apaha, was living with us that summer as housemaid and could serve as interpreter, so the old lady did not feel that she was telling her story to strangers. The recording occupied several afternoons, and I have used it as a chapter in this book, quoting her story exactly as it was given to me by Lucy. With only a few explanations regarding names and places added, she even allowed me to take her picture when the story was finished, a privilege few of the older Navajos would grant. After we had completed the story, we interviewed Bitsy Tlakai Greyhair, who was a general handyman around the trading post and perhaps 12 or 13 years younger than Grandma Claw. His story began when he was 5 years old, and his family and neighbors went to Fort Defiance, from there to the Bosque Redondo. He with his mother and a younger sister and a baby brother rode in a wagon all the way across the Pueblo country. When they came to the Rio Grande, the horses were made to swim and tow the wagon like a boat. But when it was halfway across the current tipped it over and everybody went into the water. His mother held the baby, who was strapped into a cradleboard on her head with one hand and clung to the wagon with the other. He and the smaller sister floated down the middle of the stream until a soldier on horseback caught him by one arm and lifted him onto his saddle. His sister was drowned. He could tell very little about the life at the Bosque or the return to his homeland, but he had much to tell about being captured by the Utes when he was 10 or 11 years old, and of being a slave boy for at least 6 years. He had been herding his mother's flock of sheep toward Rock Springs when a small party of Utes came riding swiftly from back of the mesa, grabbed him, and tied his hands and feet. They then watered their horses and turned north toward Ute Mountain, taking him with them. 6 years later, he stabbed his Ute owner and made his way back home. Our third informant was a woman nearly as old as Grandma Claw, who was known to us as Asan Hushkoi, Madwoman, which she was the matriarch of a large family and owned and managed a good-sized flock of sheep, and she could speak Spanish. As she lived some distance from the post, we interviewed her just the once and obtained only part of her story. She was one of the children who had never reached the Bosque Redondo, but had been stolen near the Isleta Pueblo. Her captors had sold her with 2 or 3 other children to a Jemez Indian who had traded them to a Mexican family for a number of sheep. In time, she had married a Mexican, and they returned to her parents' home to Rio Chaco, where they accumulated wealth in the form of sheep and cattle. The fourth on my list was Hosteen Lamigo's older wife, who said he was 10 or 11 years old when they went on the long walk. Her parents took her to Fort Defiance when the government ordered all Navajo families to meet there before starting to the Bosque. They were quite prosperous and had a wagon, several horses, and a flock of sheep and goats, which they took with them. But once they were one of the first families to reach the fort, they were forced to wait a whole year until the majority of their people could be rounded up and started on the long march. By this time, most of their sheep had been eaten or had died, as there was not pasture for so many, and all of their horses but 4 had been sold. They were among the first in the long procession that finally left Fort Defiance. After they had crossed the Rio Grande, a number of their group wished to go to the Place of Bells, Albuquerque, to see the mission church. She went with her mother and several other women, and a soldier was sent along to guard them. There were Mexican farms along the way, and near an orchard. A dog frightened her horse so that it ran in among the trees and she could not find her way out. A Mexican grabbed her bridle and took her to his home. The soldier did not come after her. 4 years later, when the treaty had been signed and the Navajos were allowed to return to the homeland, her father collected all the beads, rings, and silver bracelets belonging to his clan to pay her ransom. When his group reached Isleta, he hurried on ahead to locate the family who owned her. This Mexican family lived just south of Albuquerque. Her father gave them all the jewelry and he had collected to buy her freedom, but they said it was not enough. As Navajo women slaves were valued as high as $300, he waited until the whole group of Navajos came, and then he added 2 horses to the payment. They had only 2 horses left, which were ridden by her mother and an aunt. So she and her father walked during the long journey home. A very old man, whom we called Hosteen Klah, who had never outgrown his bitterness against the government and the soldiers, was next to tell his story of the long walk. His family were not so well supplied with sheep and horses as many of the Navajos, and they were fewer in number. He was about 20 years old at the time and had a wife and 1 small child. They had 1 horse and a few sheep. His wife rode the horse and carried the baby while he walked and herded the sheep. They had been told the government would give them food, but the rations were not sufficient to keep them alive. The only weapons they had were bows and arrows, and with these they killed a rabbit, antelope, and prairie dogs to eat along the way. The soldiers were mean to them, and they were held like horses in big corrals so they could not run away. While they were in Bosque Redondo, they killed and ate their sheep, and they had to go on raiding trips to steal food from the Puebloans in order to live, as the land they were given would not raise corn. The baby was the first to die, and then his brother and two of the brother's children died from eating spoiled meat the government had given them, pork. A year later, his wife died in childbirth, and the baby was born dead. Only a few of his family survived. When they were finally allowed to go back to their former homes, they stayed at Fort Wingate almost a year. When they did not start for home, the Pueblo Indians were hostile all the way, and so were the Mexican ranchers. They both stole Navajo children to trade into slavery, and also women when they could, as they wanted them for weavers. The Navajos retaliated by stealing children from the Puebloans. At Wingate, the rations issued by the government were scanty and poor in quality, much of the food not fit to eat. Sometimes they would not have a meal for 6 or 7 days, but would get along on piñons, cactus fruit, and spruce or pine buds. Their garments were made of buckskin or antelope hide, and the women wove their own squaw dresses and chief blankets for the men, but they did not sell any blankets. From Fort Wingate, they went to Fort Defiance, where better rations were provided, and each Navajo was given 2 sheep along with some farm tools for each family. Then they moved to the Chaco Valley, where they located and started a flock of sheep. They found wild horses in the valley and caught all they needed for their own use. As soon as they had horses to ride, they raided the pueblos north of Santa Fe and brought home many sheep and goats and also a few slaves. The soldiers came and told the slaves they were free to go home if they wished, but many preferred to stay, and Hosteen Escon's second wife was a girl from the Santa Clara Pueblo. This was my last interview, for an epidemic of flu swept across the reservation, taking a heavy toll of all of the older people. These records have been lying in my files for 40 years and now have been providing an important part of the material I have used. Besides these writings, my many sources of information was from Hosteen Klah, whose excellent memory furnished me an inexhaustible supply of folklore, religious myth, and legend. He was a historical facts as well as historical facts, names, and dates. I have pleasant memories of long winter evenings before the huge open fireplace, sometimes with a baby in my lap, or perhaps with my hands busy sewing some small garnishment while I listened to the deep voice of Hosteen Klah, recounting traditions of his people or tribal events that took place long before he was born. Often he would pause to say, "I may not be telling this again. Why do you not write it down?" But generally there was something else I wished to do, and often I was weary at the close of day. Occasionally I did not. I did take my notebook and write for an hour or so when the event seemed more dramatic than usual. And now these pages furnish much of the material for this book. I certainly wish I had written much more. The history of his people, as handed down orally through the generations, was a topic in which Hosteen Klah was well versed, beginning with the small, poverty-stricken bands of Navajos wandering from one river or mountain to another in search of small game, animals, seeds, or nuts to maintain their precarious existence. He followed them through the many years when they were dependent on the Puebloans for corn and beans, and during the winters, often serving a term in slavery in return for food. These Navajo servants were not allowed to live in the pueblos or even inside the walls which encircled them, but built their temporary hogans in sheltered places near the fields where they worked. From the Puebloans they gained their first knowledge of corn and soon learned to grind it and use the meal for ceremonial purposes. In order to save the best corn for themselves, the owners created a taboo that the Navajos must not touch any ears except the two small ones that grew at the very top of the corn stalk, and these were likely to be small Nubans. The other large ears were said to belong to the gods. The workers who herded the turkeys were warned not to kill a turkey or eat its flesh, as it would bring throat trouble and they would not be able to talk. To this day, the Navajos refuse to eat the flesh of a turkey. The Navajo tribe increased rapidly and soon spread out to places where they could have farms of their own with clan property rights. With the coming of the Spaniards, riding their hardy Spanish horses and accompanied by flocks of sheep and droves of cattle to furnish their food supply, the status of the Navajos greatly changed. It did not take them long to realize the importance of owning horses and sheep, and soon they acquired both. Now they no longer begged food from the Puebloans, but demanded it. A Navajo on foot was no menace to the Puebloans, but a Navajo or tribe of Navajos on horseback was a different equation. No longer were they a subservient race. They could strike, raid, and be away before the stone house dwellers could string their bows and shoot their arrows. The possession of horses brought a golden era of prosperity to the tribe. They stole sheep and goats from the Mexicans. From the Puebloans, they stole corn and beans to plant in their own extensive fields, and wherever possible, they took women and children into slavery. The wealth of a clan was counted by the size of the flock of sheep, and for every man, woman, and child there was a horse to ride. Klah invariably ended with a description of Navajo life as lived by his great-grandfather, the famous Chief Narbona, who at one time had commanded all the Navajo warriors on the eastern slope of the Chushka Mountains. It was by the number of horses he had counted his wealth. Narbona had many horses taken during many raids on different tribes, but there were only two he cared to ride. One was a beautiful Spanish Palomino, and the other was the great roan stallion he captured from the Utes. Realizing what an important place Narbona still occupied in the lives of Claw and his mother, I searched for historical records to add to Claw's story and to have written the old chief's story as part 1. With this information, I have attempted to outline the history of one family of Navajo Indians through 4 generations, and some mentions of the 5th and 6th, covering a period of almost 200 years. Lucy Hapaha, my interpreter, was a member of the 6th generation. This family may have been typically of many other Navajo families living in other sections of the Southwest. At least many of the events described herein were experienced not by this family alone, but by all the members of the Navajo Nation. In the last half of the 18th century, the population of that part of the Southwest lying between the Rio Grande and the Colorado River was predominantly Indian. The greatest number of these native inhabitants were Puebloans who lived in the walled villages or 3-storied pueblos near rivers or permanent springs and depended on agriculture for their food supply. To the north were the Utes, the Paiutes, the Arapahoes, and the San Carlos Apaches, all of whom were hunters sending out frequent war parties to raid neighboring tribes. In the south were the Mescalero Apaches, the Comanches, and the Mexicans. The semi-arid central section was occupied by the Navajos. See at that time, a Spanish informant advised the Spanish governor of the Navajo tribe consisted of about 700 families numbering 3,500 people. The informant also stated that this tribe owned 500 horses, 600 wild mares, 700 black ewes. He does not list the white ones, 40 cows and their bulls, and many short-haired Mexican goats. Claw's estimate of the number of people in their flock in their stock did not agree with this in any detail, excepting perhaps in their number of black ewes. He estimated around 1,200 families with twice as much livestock as the report listed. These Navajo families were divided into 5 groups, living in widely separated territorial divisions. The division farthest west was located in and around the Canyon de Chelly. The second occupied a mountainous region south of Zuni, which include Bear Springs, Fort Wingate, and a long section of the Rio Puerco River, or valley. A small group were located in Ciboleta near the Laguna Pueblo, and a fourth of about the same size had their homes in or near the San Mateo Mountains around Mount Taylor. The fifth and by far the largest group occupied the eastern slope of the Tohatchi and Tunicha and the Carrizo Mountains in the west and extended across the valley and mesas to the Largo Canyon in the east. The diverse characteristics of this vast territory furnished the Indians with all the essentials necessary to create prosperity. The tree-covered mountains, which furnished wood for their hogans and fires and water for melting snows to irrigate their fields, were a pleasant abode during the hot summers and a safe refuge when enemies raided the lowlands. The wide, flat mesas covered the graham grass, made excellent pastures for sheep and other livestock, and the fertile valleys, where lowlands were irrigated with little effort, became extensive fields in which corn, beans, squash, melons, pumpkins, and sometimes native tobacco were raised. The Navajo clans who had arrived in this section sometimes before 1650 were augmented by fleeing Puebloans who wished to escape the persecution of the Spanish soldiers. These fugitives were made welcome by the Navajos as they were fine pottery makers and possessed much knowledge of the use of medicinal herbs. Into a certain amount of Pueblo culture was transmitted to the Navajos along with one important healing rite, the eagle ceremony. From them, the Navajos also learned to make adobe ovens in which to bake bread and roast meat. Up to this time, bread had been patted into flat cakes and baked on hot, flat stones, while deer, antelope, and sheep were roasted over open pits. The Navajo called these newcomers the Maya, Coyote, Mai, or Coyote clan because, like the coyote, they had made their kill and then fled. The battles between the Rio Grande Puebloans and the Spanish invaders gave the Navajo raiding parties many opportunities to gather loose stock, loot corrals, and strip ripening fields. As they gained in wealth and numbers, they became more aggressive in their raiding and were greatly featured by the Mexican settlers and the more sedentary Puebloans. One of their main objectives was to obtain Pueblo girls and women, both as wives and to have pottery makers, as the Navajo women did not understand the art of making pottery. Since the Navajos and the Apaches spoke nearly the same language and had the same living customs, they frequently formed alliances for raids and depredations against the common enemy. This greatly increased the Navajo area of operations, and there came a time when they commanded and received tribute from the Spanish government. The leading chiefs of the Navajo tribe were given substantial bribes and in return halted their raids against the Spanish settlers. This truce was broken when Antonio, a prominent Navajo chief, was murdered. Later, a Spanish expedition under the leadership of Lieutenant Chacon massacred a number of Navajo women and children in Canyon del Muerto. From then on, the Navajos maintained a bitter enmity toward the Mexican and Spanish settlers and government, which lasted for more than 60 years. Okay, this is recount Frank Johnson Newcomb. Okay. Again, thank you for listening to this. That was the introduction, and I'll try to read chapter 1 in the next couple of days. Again, this is the book Hosteen Klah. Thank you for listening.